The thin hospital blanket did nothing to warm the chill that ran through my body as I stared at the email on my phone. My hands trembled, not from my recent surgery, but from the betrayal unfolding before my eyes. There, in black and white, was a document showing the transfer of my lake house, my beloved sanctuary, into my son David's name. The property I'd purchased after decades of working 60-hour weeks as a nurse. The home where I'd planned to spend my retirement years watching sunsets over the water. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Your signature, Mom. Remember? David's voice was casual, almost bored as he stood at the foot of my hospital bed. You signed it over to me right before your surgery, for safekeeping. I hadn't signed anything, not while clear-headed anyway. The morphine-induced haze of the days leading up to my emergency heart surgery left gaps in my memory, but I knew with absolute certainty I would never have willingly given away my most treasured possession. My daughter Melissa leaned against the window, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up. Mom, don't get worked up. The doctor said to keep your stress levels down. Besides, we're just protecting your assets, for all of us. As I later discovered, my children hadn't just taken my lake house. They'd systematically divided everything I owned while I lay unconscious, fighting for my life. My investment accounts, my art collection, even my grandmother's antique jewelry. What they didn't know was that I still had one card left to play, a phone call that would change everything. I was never supposed to be wealthy. Growing up in Fenwick, a small town where most families lived paycheck to paycheck, I understood the value of hard work before I was 10 years old. My father worked at the steel mill until his lungs gave out, and my mother cleaned houses for the few wealthy families on the other side of the river. We had enough to eat, but never enough to waste. When I graduated high school in 1975, I was the first in my family to continue education beyond 12th grade. I put myself through nursing school by working nights at the local diner, sleeping only 4 hours between shifts and classes. By 23, I was a registered nurse, working in the intensive care unit at Mercy Hospital. I met Harold during my second year on the job. He wasn't a doctor, or even another nurse, just a quiet, kind-eyed man who came to sit with his dying mother every day for 6 weeks. After she passed, he asked me to dinner. We were married 8 months later. Harold and I built a modest life together. We bought a small ranch house in a decent neighborhood and planned for children. David was born in 1980, and Melissa followed 2 years later. I reduced my hours to part-time while they were young, stretching our budget to make ends meet. Then, Harold was diagnosed with leukemia. 3 years of treatments drained our savings and left me a widow at 38 with 2 young children to support. I went back to full-time nursing, accepting every overtime shift I could get. I took additional certifications to increase my hourly rate. When the children were in bed, I studied medical coding and billing, eventually working weekend shifts in the hospital's administration department. David and Melissa never went without necessities, but they understood we weren't rich. Christmas was modest, vacations were camping trips to the state park. When they complained about not having the newest video games or designer clothes, I reminded them about sacrifice and priorities. We're investing in your futures, I would say. College education doesn't pay for itself. And I did pay for their education, every penny of it. David's business degree from state and Melissa's art history studies at a private liberal arts college. I remortgaged our house to cover the costs, taking on more night shifts to make the payments. I never expected gratitude, not really. Children rarely understand their parents' sacrifices until they have children of their own, but I did hope I'd raise them with values, with character. After they graduated, I continued working. Harold's medical bills had taken years to pay off, and at 55, my retirement account looked pitiful. So I kept going, picking up extra shifts, investing carefully in mutual funds that my colleague's husband recommended. Then, at 62, something unexpected happened. A patient I'd cared for during his final months, a quiet elderly man with no family, left me a substantial inheritance. Not millions, but enough to pay off my mortgage, purchase the lake house I'd always dreamed of, and finally build a comfortable retirement fund. "You showed me kindness when no one else did," his handwritten letter explained. "You deserve some peace in your golden years." David and Melissa were in their 30s by then, with families of their own. David had married Eleanor, a perfectionist, who worked in marketing and gave me 2 grandchildren who were always impeccably dressed, but rarely allowed to get dirty. Melissa had married and divorced twice, finally settling with Tim, a freelance creative consultant who seemed permanently between projects. The inheritance changed something in my children. Suddenly, they visited more often. David offered to help manage my investments. Melissa suggested I update my will to include specific provisions for my grandchildren. "Mom, you should enjoy your retirement," David would say during Sunday dinners at my house. "Let me handle the financial stress." I smiled and nodded, but kept my accounts under my own control. After years of stretching every dollar, I wasn't about to hand over my financial independence to anyone, not even my son with his business degree. Instead, I bought the lake house, a modest 2-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch and a dock that extended into the clear, deep water. I spent weekends there, often alone, sometimes with my one true friend Florence, who had been a nurse alongside me for 30 years. "This is heaven," Florence would say as we sipped wine on the porch, watching the sun set over the water. "You've earned this, Eleanor." "I just wish Harold could have seen it," I'd reply, and we'd clink glasses to his memory. For 5 years, life was good. I volunteered at a free clinic twice a week, spent time with my grandchildren when permitted, and enjoyed the peace of my lake house. My health was reasonably good, despite the occasional twinge in my chest that I attributed to age and decades of stress. Until one morning, while sweeping the porch at the lake house, the twinge became a crushing pressure. I barely managed to call 911 before collapsing. I woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit, familiar territory, but from the wrong side of the bed. A severe heart attack, they said. I would need surgery, major surgery, with a lengthy recovery period. David and Melissa arrived at the hospital within hours, faces drawn with what I interpreted as concern. They consulted with the doctors while I drifted in and out of consciousness, pain medication making the world fuzzy around the edges. "Don't worry about anything, Mom," Melissa said, stroking my hand. "We'll take care of everything while you recover." David nodded, his face serious. "I'll handle all the paperwork, insurance, bills, everything. You just focus on getting better." There were forms to sign, insurance documents, consent forms. The doctors explained the risks of the surgery, the likelihood of success. I signed where indicated, trusting the medical team I'd worked alongside for years. What I didn't realize was that David and Melissa had slipped in additional documents among the hospital paperwork. Documents I would never have signed while clear-headed. The surgery was successful but complicated. I spent 3 days in a medically induced coma and another week drifting between consciousness and sleep. By the time I was fully aware of my surroundings, David had relocated from my bedside to my lake house, and Melissa had arranged for an estate sale of my unnecessary possessions. It happened so gradually I barely noticed at first. David mentioned casually that he'd moved some funds around to cover my medical expenses. Melissa arrived one day wearing my mother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom I'd planned to pass, to my granddaughter on her 18th birthday. "I thought you'd want me to keep it safe, Mom," she said when I commented on it. "With all these hospital staff coming and going from your room, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The nurses, my former colleagues, were nothing but professional, but I didn't have the strength to argue. Not then. It wasn't until I was moved from intensive care to a regular room that I began to piece together what was happening. Nurse Janine, who had been my mentee years ago, slipped me my mail during her evening rounds. "Your son said not to bother you with this," she whispered, "but I thought you might want to see it." Among the get well cards and insurance statements was a notice from the county recorder's office confirming the transfer of my lake house property to David Mercer. There was also a bank statement showing withdrawals, large withdrawals, from my primary account. My heart monitor betrayed my rising panic, beeping faster as I stared at the papers. Janine quickly checked my vitals. "Eleanor, you need to stay calm," she urged. "Your heart can't take the stress." "My children," I managed to say, papers clutched in my trembling hands. "They're taking everything." Janine's face softened with understanding. She'd been in nursing long enough to have seen all kinds of family dynamics during medical crises. "Do you have someone you trust? Someone outside the family?" I thought immediately of Florence, my dear friend who had retired to Arizona 2 years earlier. We still spoke weekly by phone. "I need to make a call," I said. "In private." Janine nodded. "I'll give you some privacy. But promise me you'll try to keep your heart rate down. Dr. Reynolds won't be happy if you have a setback." After she left, I reached for my phone on the bedside table, only to find it missing. Of course, David had taken it to update some settings days ago and never returned it. The room's phone required a code for outside calls. Frustrated tears welled in my eyes. I was a prisoner in this hospital room, my assets being stripped away while I lay helpless. The door opened, and David entered, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing a new cashmere sweater I'd never seen before. Behind him was Melissa, sorting through what looked like brochures. "Mom, good news," David announced, placing his coffee on my tray table without asking. "We've found a fantastic assisted living facility for when you're discharged. Very exclusive, excellent care." Melissa nodded enthusiastically. "The waiting list is usually years long, but there was a recent opening, and they're holding it for you. We just need to put down a deposit to secure your spot." I stared at them, these strangers wearing my children's faces. "I'm going home after rehabilitation," I said firmly, "to my lake house." David and Melissa exchanged glances, a look I recognized from their childhood when they were hiding something. "Mom," David said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "we've been through this. You signed the lake house over to me before your surgery. You said you wanted me to have it since I have the kids." I began, but Melissa cut me off. "The doctor said you might have some memory issues after the surgery," she said smoothly. "It's totally normal. But we have the paperwork right here." She pulled a folder from her oversized purse and extracted a document. There, at the bottom, was what appeared to be my signature on a property transfer deed. It looked like my handwriting, but slightly off, as if signed while severely impaired. "This isn't right," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I would never give away my lake house." David's expression hardened slightly. "Mom, you were facing major surgery. You wanted to get your affairs in order. You told me yourself you were worried about estate taxes and probate." I had never said any such thing. In fact, I'd consulted with an estate attorney 2 years earlier and had a living trust in place specifically to avoid those issues. "Where's my phone?" I asked abruptly. "Oh," Melissa said, looking surprised. "I thought David returned it." David shrugged. "It's probably at your house. I'll look for it tonight." My house, not the lake house. They meant my primary residence. The ranch house I'd raised them in. At least they hadn't taken that yet. I'd like to be alone now, I said, turning away from them. I'm tired. Of course, Mom, Melissa said, kissing my cheek. Her lips were cold against my skin. We'll check on you tomorrow. After they left, I pressed the call button. When Janine appeared, I asked her directly, "Can you loan me your cell phone? Just for 5 minutes." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. 5 minutes, she said, placing her smartphone in my hand. I'll be back to check on you. With shaking fingers, I dialed Florence's number. When her familiar voice answered, I nearly broke down. Ellie? Is that you? I've been trying to reach you for days. Florence, I whispered, conscious of keeping my voice down. I need your help, my children. They're taking everything while I'm in the hospital. Florence didn't ask questions or express disbelief. She simply said, "Tell me what you need me to do." And in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. One phone call that would change everything. "I need you to contact Martin Goldstein," I said. Martin had been Harold's best friend and was now a retired judge. "Tell him I need him to come to the hospital immediately and bring Cassandra Mitchell with him." Cassandra was the estate attorney who had helped me establish my trust. She was sharp as a tack and took no nonsense from anyone. "Consider it done," Florence said. "And Ellie, hang in there. Help is coming." When Janine returned for her phone, I felt calmer than I had in days. My children thought they had won, thought they had successfully divided my assets while I lay vulnerable in a hospital bed. They had no idea what was coming. Janine came back for her phone just as I was ending the call with Florence. The determined look in my eyes must have caught her attention because she paused, studying my face. "You've got a plan," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded slightly, careful not to let my excitement raise my heart rate. "Let's just say, I'm not as helpless as my children think." She smiled, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "Good for you, Eleanor. I've seen too many elderly patients steamrolled by family members who think they know best." She checked my vitals with practiced efficiency. "Your blood pressure is elevated but within acceptable limits. Try to rest now. Whatever you're planning can wait until you're stronger." But I knew it couldn't wait. David and Melissa were moving quickly, dismantling my life piece by piece. Every hour that passed meant another asset potentially transferred, another account emptied, another piece of my independence stripped away. I feigned sleepiness until Janine left, then stared at the ceiling, mentally cataloging what I still had in my possession. My purse was in the room's small closet. I'd insisted on keeping it nearby even during the worst days of my recovery. Inside was my driver's license, credit cards, and checkbook. Not much, but enough to establish my identity and prove I still had my faculties. The bigger challenge would be proving I hadn't willingly signed over my properties. I had no doubt. The signatures were technically mine. Forged signatures would be too easily disputed. No, they had been clever. They'd waited until I was heavily medicated, then guided my hand across the papers, murmuring encouragements that my drug-addled brain had likely interpreted as standard medical forms. I dozed off despite my determination to stay alert, the post-surgical exhaustion overwhelming my resolve. When I awakened, the room was dim, lit only by the monitors and the faint glow filtering through the partially closed blinds. According to the wall clock, it was just past 6:30 p.m. A figure sat in the visitor's chair beside my bed. For a moment, my heart leapt with hope that Martin or Cassandra had already arrived, but as my vision cleared, I recognized Melissa's husband, Tim. His lanky frame was slouched in the chair, attention fixed on his phone. "Tim," I said, my voice raspy from sleep. He startled, nearly dropping his phone. "Oh, Eleanor, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Despite everything, I almost smiled. Tim was the only one who consistently called me Eleanor rather than Mom, a small courtesy I'd always appreciated. He wasn't my child, after all, and at 67, I was more than just somebody's mother. "I've been better," I replied honestly. "Where's Melissa?" "At your house with the estate appraiser," he said, then immediately looked as if he regretted the words. "I mean, she's just getting some things organized for when you come home." An estate appraiser, so they were already preparing to sell, my primary residence too. The confirmation should have hurt, but instead, it strengthened my resolve. "And David?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Tim shifted uncomfortably. "He's at the lake house with Eleanor and the kids. They're, settling in for the weekend. Settling in my lake house. The sanctuary I'd purchased with money earned through decades of night shifts and overtime. The place where I'd finally found peace after years of struggling to provide for everyone else." A white-hot anger flared in my chest, but I tamped it down. Now wasn't the time for confrontation. "That's nice," I said mildly. "And what brings you here, Tim? Surely not just to keep an old woman company on a Friday evening." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Melissa asked me to bring you some paperwork. Nothing urgent, just some insurance forms the hospital needs for your continuing care." Of course. More documents for me to sign while isolated and vulnerable. "I'd be happy to look at them," I said, "but I'm feeling a bit foggy from the pain medication. Maybe you could leave them, and I'll review them when I'm clearer-headed." Tim hesitated, clearly having been instructed not to leave without my signature. "They're pretty straightforward," he said, pulling a manila envelope from his messenger bag. I could help explain anything confusing. "Actually," came a crisp voice from the doorway, "I'd advise Mrs. Mercer not to sign anything without proper legal review." We both turned to see a woman in her 40s with a sleek bob haircut and a charcoal pantsuit standing in the doorway. Even without introduction, I would have recognized Cassandra Mitchell. Her reputation as a fierce advocate for her elderly clients was well earned. "Ms. Mitchell," I said, relief washing over me. "Thank you for coming." Tim stood abruptly, clutching the envelope to his chest. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Cassandra Mitchell, Esquires, Mrs. Mercer's attorney." She stepped fully into the room, her presence somehow making the small space feel even more confined. "And you are?" "Tim Lawson, Melissa's husband. I was just bringing some hospital forms." "How convenient," Cassandra interrupted, extending her hand. "I'll take those. As Mrs. Mercer's legal representative, I'll need to review any documents before she considers signing them." Tim looked to me, clearly hoping I'd intervene. Instead, I gave him a placid smile. "It's all right, Tim. Ms. Mitchell handles all my legal affairs." With obvious reluctance, he surrendered the envelope. Cassandra took it without opening it, tucking it into her leather portfolio. "I should call Melissa," Tim said, reaching for his phone. "That won't be necessary," said another voice, and Martin Goldstein appeared in the doorway. Despite being in his mid-70s, Martin maintained the commanding presence that had served him well during his decades on the bench. "Mr. Lawson, I suggest you leave now. Mrs. Mercer needs her rest, and she has legal matters to discuss with her representatives." Tim looked from Martin to Cassandra to me, clearly realizing he was outmatched. I'll let Melissa know you have visitors," he said weakly, edging toward the door. "Please do," I said. "In fact, tell both my children I'd like to see them tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock sharp." After Tim departed, Martin closed the door and turned to me with concern in his eyes. "Eleanor, what in God's name is going on?" Florence was practically in hysterics when she called me. "My children are stealing from me, Martin," I said simply. "They're taking everything while I'm too weak to fight back." Over the next hour, I detailed everything I'd discovered. The property transfer, the missing funds, the talk of assisted living. Cassandra took meticulous notes, while Martin's expression grew increasingly grim. "The property transfer is particularly concerning," Cassandra said, reviewing the copy that had been in my mail. This signature is questionable at best. Were you under the influence of pain medication when this was supposedly signed? Absolutely, I confirmed. The date on the document is 3 days before my surgery. I was already hospitalized and on a morphine drip for pre-surgical pain management. She nodded, making another note. And did any independent witnesses observe you signing this document? Not that I recall, though my memories of that time are admittedly hazy. That works in our favor, Martin interjected. If they can't, produce credible witnesses to your signing, which they won't if it happened while you were medicated. We can challenge the validity of the transfer. What about my other assets? I asked. My investment accounts? My personal belongings? Cassandra frowned. Did you grant either of your children power of attorney? No, I said firmly. After Harold died, I updated all my legal documents. I designated Florence as my medical proxy and Martin as my financial power of attorney in case of incapacitation. Martin and Cassandra exchanged glances. Then they had no legal right to access your accounts without explicit authorization, Cassandra stated. We can demand an immediate accounting of all transactions since your hospitalization. And we should move quickly, Martin added. The longer they have control of your assets, the more difficult recovery becomes. Cassandra opened her portfolio and extracted a different set of documents. I've taken the liberty of drafting emergency injunctions to freeze any further transfers of your properties or funds. With your permission, we can file these first thing tomorrow morning. The decisiveness with which they approached my situation brought tears to my eyes. After days of feeling powerless against my own children's machinations, I finally had allies who could help me fight back. There's one more thing, I said, wiping away a tear. The assisted living facility they mentioned. I'm concerned they're planning to have me declared incompetent and force me into institutionalized care. Martin's expression darkened. Not uncommon, unfortunately. Adult children sometimes convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest by taking control, especially when substantial assets are involved. We should arrange for an independent medical evaluation, Cassandra suggested. Establish clearly that you're competent to manage your own affairs. Dr. Reynolds, my cardiologist, would vouch for me, I said. He's known me professionally for 30 years. Excellent, Cassandra nodded. We'll speak with him tomorrow before your children arrive. By the time they left, night had fully descended, and the hospital had grown quiet. Despite the gravity of my situation, I felt lighter than I had in days. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Confronting my children's betrayal would be painful for all of us. But at least now I had a fighting chance. Sleep came more easily that night, deep and dreamless. I awakened to sunlight streaming through, the hospital blinds and the sound of Dr. Reynolds' voice. Neurologically, she's entirely sound, he was saying. The cardiac event and subsequent surgery have had no impact on her cognitive function. I opened my eyes to find Dr. Reynolds speaking, with Cassandra near the door. Martin sat in the visitor's chair reviewing documents. Good morning, I said, pushing myself more upright in the bed. Dr. Reynolds approached with a warm smile. Eleanor, you're looking much better today. How are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck, I admitted. But my mind is clear. He nodded, making a note in my chart. I've just been explaining to Ms. Mitchell that while you've experienced a significant cardiac event, your cognitive abilities remain entirely intact. There is absolutely no medical reason you would be unable to manage your own affairs once you're physically recovered. Thank you, Stephen, I said, using his first name as I had for decades as colleagues. I appreciate your candor. I've also expressed my concerns about the timing of these property transfers, he continued, his expression more serious. As your physician, I can state unequivocally that you were under the influence of powerful pain medications during the days surrounding your surgery, Any documents signed during that period should be considered suspect at minimum. Cassandra looked pleased. Dr. Reynolds has agreed to provide a formal statement to that effect, she told me. We've also spoken with Nurse Janine, who confirms she observed signs of distress when you discovered the property transfer. Not confusion about having signed it, but genuine shock and betrayal. Which supports our contention that you never knowingly authorized these transfers, Martin added. The door opened, and a hospital aide entered with my breakfast tray. As she arranged it on the rolling table, Martin and Cassandra stepped outside with Dr. Reynolds to continue their conversation privately. Alone for a moment, I picked at the bland hospital food, my mind racing ahead to the confrontation to come. What would I say to my children? How could I look into the faces I'd loved since they took their first breaths and acknowledge the depth of their betrayal? My melancholy reflections were interrupted by a gentle knock. Janine peeked in, holding a small zippered bag. I thought you might want to freshen up before your visitors arrive, she said, placing the bag on the bed. Just some basics: toothbrush, hairbrush, a bit of makeup. The simple kindness brought tears to my eyes. Thank you, Janine. She smiled, then lowered her voice. Your son and daughter are already here, arguing with the nurse at the station. They're not happy about being told to wait until 10. Of course they weren't. David and Melissa had always been impatient, even as children. They wanted what they wanted immediately. Consequences be damned. Let them wait, I said, straightening my shoulders. I'll be ready at 10, not a minute before. Janine squeezed my hand before leaving. With determination, I used the small mirror from the toiletry bag to apply a touch of lipstick and smooth my silver hair. The face that looked back at me was pale and drawn from illness, but the eyes were clear and resolute. By 9:55, I was sitting up in bed, looking as dignified as possible in a hospital gown. Martin and Cassandra had positioned themselves strategically, Martin standing by the window, Cassandra seated in a chair near the foot of my bed, paperwork arrayed before her. At precisely 10 bounds, there was a sharp knock, and David entered without waiting for a response. He stopped abruptly when he spotted Martin and Cassandra, causing Melissa to bump into him from behind. Mom, what's going on? David demanded, recovering quickly. Who are these people? David, Melissa, I said calmly. This is Judge Martin Goldstein, you remember him from your father's funeral, and my attorney, Cassandra Mitchell. Your attorney? Melissa repeated, her voice rising. Why do you need an attorney in the hospital? I met her gaze steadily. To help me understand how my lake house was transferred to David's name without my knowledge or consent. And to explain why my investment accounts have been emptied. David's face flushed red. Mom, we've been through this. You signed the papers yourself. You were worried about your recovery, about potential nursing home costs eating up your estate. Mrs. Mercer was under heavy medication at the time of these supposed signatures, Cassandra interjected, her tone clinical. Her physician has confirmed she was in no condition to provide informed consent to any legal documents during that period. This is ridiculous, David sputtered, turning to me. Mom, tell them you knew what you were signing. I did not, I said firmly. And we both know it, David. You took advantage of my vulnerable state to steal what you couldn't convince me to give you freely. Melissa stepped forward, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. Mom, you're confused. The doctors said memory problems are common after major surgery. Mrs. Mercer's cognitive function has been independently evaluated, Martin cut in. She is entirely competent, and her memory is intact. Who are you to interfere in our family business? David demanded, rounding on Martin. This is between us and our mother. Martin remained unruffled. I am your mother's designated power of attorney for financial matters, have been for years, which means any financial decisions made while she was incapacitated should have gone through me. Not you. The color drained from David's face. She never told us that. I shouldn't have needed to, I said quietly. You shouldn't have been making any decisions about my property regardless. Cassandra cleared her throat. We've prepared injunctions to freeze all further transfers of Mrs. Mercer's assets. We're also filing to invalidate the Lake House transfer based on Mrs. Mercer's incapacity at the time of signing. Additionally, Martin added, we're requesting a full accounting of all funds withdrawn from Mrs. Mercer's accounts since her hospitalization. Any expenditures not directly related to her medical care will need to be justified or returned. David turned to me, his expression hardening. So that's how it's going to be? You're suing your own children? I'm protecting what's mine, I corrected him. What I worked my entire life to build. What I sacrificed for, including putting both of you through college without a penny of student debt. We were just trying to protect you, Melissa insisted, tears forming in her eyes. The doctors weren't sure you'd survive the surgery. We had to make contingency plans. Contingency plans that conveniently put my lake house in David's name and my investment funds in your account? I asked skeptically. That doesn't sound like protection, Melissa. It sounds like theft. You ungrateful, David began, but... Martin stepped forward, placing himself between my son and my bed. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years on the bench. Mrs. Mercer is still recovering from major surgery. This discussion is now over. You can't just throw us out, David protested. She's our mother. Actually, as her medical proxy, I can limit visitors if they're causing distress, came Florence's voice from the doorway. She stood there, travel-worn but determined, having flown in from Arizona overnight at my request. And right now you're both causing considerable distress. The sight of Florence, my dear friend who had dropped everything to come to my aid, brought fresh tears to my eyes. Flo, I whispered. She crossed the room to take my hand, ignoring my children completely. I'm here now, Ellie. Everything's going to be all right. Height! David looked from Florence to Martin to Cassandra, finally realizing the extent of the alliance against him. This isn't over, he said coldly. Mom, when you're thinking clearly again, you'll realize we were only trying to help. Perhaps you should leave now, Cassandra suggested, before we discuss the potential criminal implications of what you've done. Elder financial abuse is taken very seriously by prosecutors these days. The mention of criminal charges visibly rattled both my children. Without another word, they retreated, David's arm around Melissa's shoulders as they disappeared down the corridor. The room fell silent in their wake. Florence pulled up a chair beside my bed, still holding my hand. I can't believe they would do this, she said softly. Your own children. I've been blind, I admitted. For years, I've excused their self-centeredness, their entitlement. I told myself it was normal generational differences, that they'd mature eventually. I shook my head sadly. But this reveals who they truly are, and who I've been. An enabler, always giving, never holding them accountable. Martin approached the other side of the bed. Don't be too hard on yourself, Eleanor. You did what parents do. You loved unconditionally. They're the ones who failed, not you. Cassandra began gathering her paperwork. I'll file these documents immediately. With Dr. Reynolds' statement and the hospital records showing your medication levels, we have a strong case for invalidating the property transfer. And I'll contact the banks first thing Monday morning, Martin added. As your financial power of attorney, I can request an immediate freeze on all your accounts. I nodded gratefully, overwhelmed by their efficiency and support. Thank you, all of you. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have figured something out, Florence said firmly. You're the strongest person I know, Eleanor Mercer. You raised 2 children alone after Harold died, worked impossible hours to put them through college, and built a comfortable retirement for yourself through sheer determination. Don't start doubting yourself now. Her confidence in me was like a balm to my wounded spirit. Florence had always seen me clearly, both my strengths and my weaknesses, and loved me anyway. "What happens now?" I asked, looking at Cassandra. "Now," she said, "we fight. We claw back everything they've taken. We secure your assets against further attempts to access them. And we ensure you maintain complete control over your own life and decisions." "It won't be easy," Martin cautioned. "Family financial disputes rarely are. There will be ugliness, accusations, attempts to paint you as incompetent despite the medical evidence." "I'm prepared for that," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "I've spent my entire life caring for others, my patients, my husband through his illness, my children through every stage of their lives. It's time I stood up for myself with the same dedication." Florence squeezed my hand. "And this time, you won't be standing alone." In that moment, surrounded by people who had come to my aid not out of obligation or expectation of gain, but out of genuine care and respect, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt of my children's betrayal was still there, a wound that would likely never fully heal. But alongside it grew a new resolve, a commitment to reclaiming what was mine and rebuilding my life on my own terms. The road ahead would be difficult. Recovery from heart surgery alone would take months. The legal battles to recover my property and funds might drag on even longer. But for the first time since waking up in the cardiac unit, I felt hope, not just that I would survive, but that I would emerge from this ordeal stronger and wiser than before. As Cassandra and Martin departed to begin the legal proceedings, Florence settled into the chair beside my bed, prepared to stand guard against any further intrusions by my children. "You should rest," she urged. "You've had enough excitement for one day." I nodded, suddenly aware of how the confrontation had drained my limited energy. "Will you stay?" "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," she promised. "Sleep now. I'll be here when you wake up." As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself thinking not of David and Melissa's betrayal, but of the lake house, my sanctuary with its wraparound porch and peaceful water views. I would sit there again, I vowed silently. I would reclaim not just my property, but my independence, my dignity, and my right to determine my own future. The thought accompanied me into dreams, not of loss and betrayal, but of sunrise over still waters and the promise of new beginnings. The hospital discharged me 3 weeks after my surgery, far earlier than the doctors had initially predicted. My determination to regain independence had surprised even Dr. Reynolds, who remarked that my recovery was progressing at twice the expected rate. "You've always been stubborn," he said during our final consultation, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Just don't overdo it. Heart tissue needs time to heal properly, no matter how strong your will." I promised to follow the rehabilitation protocol meticulously, knowing that my physical strength would be essential for the battles ahead. Florence had extended her stay indefinitely, moving into my ranch house to help with my recovery. We'd converted the dining room into a temporary bedroom so I wouldn't have to navigate the stairs. "It's like college again," Florence joked as she helped me settle onto the adjustable hospital bed that had been delivered the day before my discharge. "Remember our first apartment? That fold-out sofa you found at the thrift store?" I smiled at the memory. "The one with the broken spring that nearly impaled you when you sat on the wrong spot?" "Those were the days," she sighed, arranging my medications on the bedside table. "Young, broke, and convinced we could change the world one patient at a time." "And now look at us," I said, gesturing to my makeshift bedroom. "Old, fighting our own children for our life savings, and still idealistic enough to believe in justice." Florence snorted. "Speak for yourself. I gave up on justice years ago. I just want to see those kids of yours get what's coming to them." Her fierce loyalty warmed my heart. Florence had never had children of her own, Too busy putting out fires in the ER, she'd always said, but she'd been a second mother to David and Melissa during their childhood. Their betrayal had wounded her almost as deeply as it had me. Our reminiscing was interrupted by the doorbell. Florence peered through the window before opening the door. "It's Cassandra," she called back to me. "And she's smiling. Must be good news." Cassandra Mitchell entered with her usual crisp efficiency, but there was indeed a satisfied gleam in her eye as she set her briefcase on the coffee table. "We've had our first victory," she announced without preamble. "The judge has granted our emergency injunction. All transfers from your accounts have been frozen, and the lake house property cannot be sold or further encumbered pending our hearing." Relief flooded through me. "That's wonderful news." "There's more," Cassandra continued, extracting documents from her briefcase. "The bank has provided preliminary statements showing significant withdrawals from your accounts immediately, following your hospitalization. Over $230,000 withdrawn in a 2-week period." Florence gasped. "That's outrageous. What were they thinking?" "They were thinking their mother was either going to die or be too incapacitated to notice," I said grimly. "Can we recover the funds?" "We're working on it," Cassandra replied. Some of the money was transferred to new accounts in David and Melissa's names, which we can petition to freeze. Other funds appear to have been withdrawn as cashier's checks are used for large purchases. She laid a printout on the coffee table, pointing to several highlighted transactions. This $42,000 withdrawal was used to purchase a new Mercedes SUV, registered in David's name. These 3 withdrawals totaling $75,000 were transferred to an account belonging to Melissa's husband, Tim. My stomach twisted at the evidence of their greed laid out in black and white. "They didn't even wait to see if I would survive the surgery," I murmured. "Unfortunately, that's common in these cases," Cassandra said, her voice softening slightly. "When family members see an opportunity to access substantial assets, some act impulsively, convinced they'll never be caught or held accountable." "And will they be?" Florence asked bluntly. "Held accountable, I mean." Cassandra straightened, her professional demeanor returning. "That's entirely up to Mrs. Mercer. We have several options, ranging from civil recovery actions to criminal charges for elder financial abuse." Both women looked at me expectantly. The question had been haunting me since I'd first discovered what my children had done. How far was I willing to go to seek justice? Could I truly subject my own flesh and blood to criminal prosecution, no matter how justified? "Let's focus on recovery first," I decided. "Get back my house, my funds, my property. If they cooperate, perhaps we can avoid criminal charges." Cassandra nodded, making a note. "A reasonable approach. I should mention, however, that we've received a counteroffering from David's attorney." "David has an attorney already?" I was surprised at how quickly he'd mobilized his defense. "Gerald Finch?" Cassandra confirmed, her expression conveying what she thought of the man. "He's known for representing adult children in disputes with elderly parents, specializes in competency challenges." My heart sank. "They're going to claim I'm incompetent. They're attempting to, yes. The counteroffering suggests you voluntarily submit to a neuropsychological evaluation by a specialist of their choosing." Florence scoffed. "Absolutely not. They'll find some quack who'll declare her senile regardless of the evidence." "That's my assessment as well," Cassandra agreed. "We've already submitted Dr. Reynolds' evaluation supporting your competency, along with statements from the hospital staff who interacted with you daily. We're on solid ground legally." I sighed, leaning back against my pillows as fatigue washed over me. Despite my determination, my body still had limits. "What's our next step?" "We have a hearing scheduled for next Monday before Judge Harlow. She'll review our request to invalidate the property transfer and order the return of funds. David and Melissa have been summoned to appear." The thought of facing my children in court, on opposite sides of a legal battle, sent a fresh wave. of pain through my chest that had nothing to do with my surgery. How had we come to this? Will I need to testify? I asked. Most likely, yes, Cassandra replied gently. Your first-hand account of what happened, or rather, what didn't happen, regarding the property transfer will be crucial. I nodded, steeling myself. Then I'll be ready. After Cassandra left, Florence helped me prepare for bed, her movements efficiently gentle as she assisted me with the evening routine of medications, checking my incision, and ensuring everything I might need during the night was within reach. You're too good at this, I observed as she fluffed my pillows. Sure you didn't miss your calling as a private nurse? She snorted. 30 years in the emergency room was enough healthcare for me. Thank you very much. Besides, she added with a wink, the pay is better when you're just the bossy friend. Once settled, I found myself staring at the ceiling, mind racing despite my physical exhaustion. Florence, perceptive as always, pulled up a chair beside the bed instead of retiring. To the guest room. Want to talk about it? She asked simply. I keep trying to pinpoint where I went wrong with them, I admitted, voicing the thought that had been haunting me since discovering my children's betrayal. Was I too lenient? Too strict? Did I give them too much? Not enough? Florence considered. This, her expression thoughtful. You know, I've watched you raise those two from the time they were in diapers. You were firm, but fair. Generous without spoiling them. You taught them the value of education, hard work, integrity. Then why? My voice caught. Why would they do this? Because some people, no matter how well they're raised, choose selfishness. When given the opportunity, she said bluntly. And some children never outgrow viewing their parents as resources to be exploited, rather than people to be respected. Her candor was oddly comforting. Florence had never sugar-coated the truth, not in 40 years of friendship. I keep wondering if I'll ever be able to forgive them, I whispered. She took my hand, her grip firm and warm. Don't worry about forgiveness yet, Ellie. Focus on justice first. Forgiveness, if it comes, can follow later. I managed a small smile. When did you get so wise? Watching you, she replied without hesitation. Now get some sleep. We've got a long road ahead. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of rehabilitation exercises, consultations with Cassandra, and careful avoidance of any contact with my children. They had attempted to visit several times, but Florence had sent them away, enforcing the boundaries I'd established through Cassandra. Only once had David become confrontational, threatening to call the police if he wasn't allowed to see his mother. Go ahead, Florence had told him through the barely opened door, phone in hand. I'll save you the trouble and dial for you. I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about the $230,000 you've stolen from your mother's accounts. He'd retreated quickly after that. By the day of the hearing, I felt stronger physically, though the emotional toll continued to weigh heavily. Martin arrived early to drive us to the courthouse, insisting on handling my wheelchair himself, despite the court officers offering assistance. I've got her, he said protectively. She's been taking care of everyone else for decades. Today, we take care of her. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, intimate almost, with dark wood paneling and muted lighting. Cassandra had arranged for me to wait in a private conference room until the case was called, sparing me the stress of sitting in the main courtroom where I might encounter my children before the proceedings began. When the bailiff finally came, to escort us in, my heart hammered against my healing sternum. As we entered, I immediately spotted David and Melissa seated at the table on the right side of the courtroom. David wore a conservative gray suit, his posture rigid with tension. Melissa had opted for a modest navy dress, her usual flashy style subdued for the occasion. Neither looked at me as Martin wheeled me to the plaintiff's table where Cassandra was already arranging her documents. I kept my gaze forward, focusing on the empty judge's bench rather than my children's profiles. All rise, the bailiff announced. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Elaine Harlow presiding. Judge Harlow was a woman, perhaps a decade, younger than me, with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob and penetrating dark eyes that surveyed the courtroom with experienced efficiency. She nodded for everyone to be seated, then adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the file before her. Mercer v. Mercer and Lawson, she stated, regarding alleged financial exploitation of an elder and invalid property transfer. Ms. Mitchell, you may present your case. Cassandra rose, her voice clear and measured as she outlined the situation: my hospitalization, the unauthorized property transfer, the systematic emptying of my accounts. She presented affidavits from Dr. Reynolds and the hospital staff regarding my mental state during the period when the documents were supposedly signed. Your Honor, the evidence clearly establishes that Mrs. Eleanor Mercer was heavily medicated and recovering from life-threatening cardiac surgery when these documents were presented for her signature. She had no opportunity to review them independently, no access to legal counsel, and was not mentally capable of providing informed consent to such significant financial transactions. Judge Harlow nodded, making notes. And the defendant's response? Gerald Finch, a florid man with an expensive suit and an air of practiced concern, stood. Your Honor, this is fundamentally a family misunderstanding that has been unnecessarily escalated to legal proceedings. My clients, Mrs. Mercer's children, were acting in accordance with their mother's repeatedly expressed wishes to protect her assets from potential long-term care costs following her serious health crisis. I had to fight to keep my expression neutral at this blatant falsehood. I had never, not once, expressed any such wishes to my children. Mr. Finch, Judge Harlow said, peering over her glasses, do you have documentation of these repeatedly expressed wishes? Written instructions, perhaps? Or witnessed verbal directives? Finch cleared his throat. We have sworn statements from both Mr. Mercer and Mrs. Lawson, attesting to numerous conversations with their mother regarding her estate planning intentions. So that would be a no on documentation, Judge Harlow observed dryly. Ms. Mitchell, does your client wish to address these alleged conversations? Cassandra turned to me, and at my nod, helped me to my feet. I had insisted on standing for this part, wanting to face the court, and my children, on my own 2 feet despite my weakened condition. Your Honor, I began, my voice steadier than I'd feared it might be. I never instructed my children to transfer my property or access my financial accounts. On the contrary, I had explicitly arranged for Judge Martin Goldstein to serve as my financial power of attorney in the event I became incapacitated, specifically to ensure my assets would be properly managed according to my established estate plan. Judge Harlow's gaze was direct but not unkind. Mrs. Mercer, were you aware that your son had transferred your lake house property into his name? Absolutely not, Your Honor. That property represents my retirement sanctuary, purchased with funds I earned during decades of nursing service. I would never have willingly transferred it to anyone, least of all during a medical crisis when my future care needs were uncertain. And the financial withdrawals? Nearly $250,000, according to the records presented. Shook my head firmly. I had no knowledge of these withdrawals until after recovering from surgery. I never authorized them, either verbally or in writing. Judge Harlow turned toward the defendant's table. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Lawson, do either of you wish to address the court regarding these statements? David stood, straightening his tie nervously. Your Honor, my mother is confused about the timing of these discussions. We had many conversations about protecting her assets prior to her heart attack. That's not true, I interrupted, unable to let the lie stand. Judge Harlow held up her hand. Mrs. Mercer, please allow your son to finish. You'll have an opportunity to respond. I pressed my lips together, nodding apologetically. David continued, his confidence seemingly bolstered by the judge's intervention. My mother has always been concerned about the possibility of needing long-term care and how it might deplete her savings. The lake house transfer was a strategic asset protection move, entirely in line with her previously stated wishes. Judge Harlow's expression remained impassive. And the $42,000 withdrawal used to purchase a Mercedes registered in your name? Was that also asset protection? David flushed. The timing was coincidental. I had been planning that purchase for months. With your mother's funds? He had no answer for that. The judge turned to Melissa. Mrs. Lawson, what about the $75,000 transferred to accounts belonging to you and your husband? Melissa stood, hands clutched nervously before her. Mom always said she wanted to help us financially when she could. We thought, with her illness, that she would want us to secure those funds before they might be claimed for medical expenses. Without consulting her? Or the person she had legally designated to make financial decisions during her incapacity? Melissa's gaze dropped to the table. We were trying to honor what we believed were her wishes. I listened to my children's justifications with a strange detachment, as if hearing strangers describe events that had nothing to do with me. In a way, that's exactly what was happening. These people, these entitled, self-serving individuals, were not the children I thought I had raised. After both sides had presented their evidence and arguments, Judge Harlow called a brief recess to review the documents. As we waited in the conference room, Cassandra seemed cautiously optimistic. Judge Harlow has a strong record of protecting elderly plaintiffs in financial exploitation cases, she noted. And their defense is remarkably weak. She wanted us to have it, rarely succeeds without supporting documentation. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Harlow wasted no time delivering her ruling. Having reviewed the evidence presented, I find clear and convincing proof that Mrs. Eleanor Mercer did not knowingly or willingly transfer her lake house property to Mr. David Mercer. The transfer deed, signed while Mrs. Mercer was under the influence of powerful pain medications and without independent legal counsel, is hereby declared invalid. The property shall be returned to Mrs. Mercer's name immediately. Relief washed through me at these words, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering the freezing of all assets and funds transferred from Mrs. Mercer's accounts since the date of her hospitalization. Mr. Mercer and Mrs. Lawson are directed to provide a full accounting of all withdrawn funds within 7 days, including documentation of how those funds were spent or invested. She fixed my children with a stern gaze. The court takes a very dim view of what has occurred here. While I am not at this time referring this matter for criminal investigation, I want to be absolutely clear that what you have done, regardless of your claimed intentions, constitutes elder financial exploitation under state law. David's attorney began to object, but Judge Harlow cut him off. Mr. Finch, your clients are fortunate that their mother has chosen, so far, not to pursue criminal charges. I strongly advise them to cooperate fully with the court's orders regarding the return of her property and funds. With a sharp rap of her gavel, the hearing was concluded. I sat in stunned silence as the reality sank in. I had won. My lake house would be returned to me. There would be a full accounting of the stolen funds. But as I watched my children gather their belongings, their faces set in expressions of resentment rather than remorse, I realized this legal victory was only the beginning of a much longer, more painful process. The relationship we had once shared was irreparably damaged. Even if every dollar was returned, the trust that had been broken could never be fully restored. Outside the courtroom, I asked Martin to wait before wheeling me to the car. I needed a moment to collect myself, to process everything that had happened. As I sat quietly, I became aware of approaching footsteps and looked up to see David standing before me. His expression a complex mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "Mom," he began, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Not here, David. Not now. When then? He demanded, a hint of the entitlement that had led to this situation creeping back into his voice. You won't take our calls. You won't let us visit. How are we supposed to fix this if you won't even talk to us? I looked at my son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. When had he become this person? This stranger who could justify stealing from his own mother? Who could stand before me now, after everything that had been revealed in court, and act as if I were the unreasonable one? Some things can't be fixed, David, I said finally, my voice soft but firm. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple apologies or explanations. So that's it? After everything we've been through as a family, you're just going to write us off over a misunderstanding about money? The audacity of his characterization, a misunderstanding about money, left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice again, it was steadier than I'd expected. This was never about the money, David. It was about respect, about honesty, about recognizing me as a person with rights and dignity, not just a collection of assets to be divided. Up the moment I became vulnerable, I paused, letting the words sink in. When you can understand that distinction, maybe then we can talk. I gestured to Martin, who had been waiting discreetly nearby, and he moved forward to wheel me away. David made no move to follow, and I didn't look back to see his expression. Some doors once closed are better left that way. In the car driving home, Florence squeezed my hand. You did it, Ellie. You stood up for yourself. I nodded, watching the city blocks pass by outside the window. Yes, I did. Then why don't you look happier? I turned to her with a sad smile. Because winning doesn't feel the way I thought. It would. I got my property back, but I lost my children in the process. You didn't lose them, Florence corrected gently. You just finally saw them clearly. There's a difference. As we pulled into my driveway, I realized she was right. This painful episode had stripped away the illusions I'd maintained about my children for years. It had forced me to see who they truly were, not who I had wished them to be. And painful as that clarity was, it was also, in its way, a gift. A chance to rebuild my life on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable deception. A chance to redirect my remaining years toward genuine connections rather than obligatory family ties maintained out of habit or expectation. Martin helped me from the car, supporting me as I insisted on walking to my front door rather than using the wheelchair. Each step was a small victory, a reclaiming of independence. What will you do now? He asked as we reached the porch. I looked at my modest ranch house, then beyond it to where I knew my lake house stood, waiting for my return. Love, I said simply. On my own terms, for however many years I have left. It wasn't the retirement I had envisioned, surrounded by loving family, watching grandchildren grow, passing down wisdom and heirlooms to the next generation. But it was real. And after decades of sacrifice and compromise, perhaps that authenticity was worth more than any comfortable illusion. The rehabilitation process was grueling. Each day brought a new challenge, a new pain to overcome, but I approached my recovery with the same methodical determination that had carried me through nursing, school, through widowhood, through raising 2 children alone. I refused to be defined by my physical limitations or by my children's betrayal. 6 months after the court hearing, I stood on the dock of my lake house, watching the autumn sun set over the water. The maple trees lining the shore had turned, brilliant shades of red and gold, their colors intensified by the golden hour light. I breathed deeply, savoring the crisp air and the profound silence that was only occasionally interrupted by a loon's haunting call. "Tea's ready," Florence called from the porch. I turned with a smile. Florence had decided to extend her Arizona sabbatical indefinitely, renting out her condo there and moving into my guest room. "Just until you're fully recovered," she'd insisted, though we both knew her presence had become about more than my physical healing. "Coming," I called back, taking one last look at the tranquil water before making my way up the gentle slope from the dock. My progress was slow but steady, each step a testament to how far I'd come since the surgery. The carved walking stick Martin had given me. Every queen needs a proper scepter, he'd joked, provided necessary support while allowing me to maintain my dignity and independence. Florence had arranged a cozy scene on the porch. 2 Adirondack chairs with cushions, a small table between them holding a teapot, 2 mugs and a plate of ginger snaps. She'd draped woolen blankets over the backs of the chairs against the evening chill. Quite the picture of retirement bliss, I observed, lowering myself carefully into one of the chairs. That was the idea, she replied, pouring the tea. Though, I never imagined I'd be spending my golden years as your personal Florence Nightingale. The name coincidence is a bit on the nose, don't you think? I laughed, accepting the steaming mug she handed me. Perhaps you were destined for this role all along. Heaven forbid, she mock-shuddered. I've spent enough of my life tending. To the sick and injured, thank you very much. We sipped our tea in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower behind the trees. These quiet moments had become a cherished ritual over the past months, a peaceful pause in days otherwise filled with physical therapy appointments, legal consultations, and the ongoing work of rebuilding my finances. The financial recovery had been almost as challenging as the physical one. Despite the court order, retrieving the funds my children had taken proved complicated. The money that had been transferred to their accounts was relatively straightforward to recover, but the cash withdrawals and purchases presented greater challenges. David had indeed purchased a Mercedes with my money, but he'd already traded it in for another vehicle plus cash. Melissa and Tim had used some of their ill-gotten funds for a lavish vacation to the Maldives and invested the rest in Tim's perpetually failing business ventures. By the time the court orders were enforced, nearly $80,000 of my money had been irretrievably spent. Have you given any more thought to Martin's suggestion? Florence asked, interrupting my financial musings. Martin had proposed filing a civil lawsuit to recover the remaining funds, potentially including additional damages for emotional distress. It's your right, he'd argued. They shouldn't be allowed to simply spend $80,000 of your dollars without consequences. I sighed, watching the steam rise from my mug. Honestly, I'm tired of courtrooms and legal battles. I got back my lake house and most of my savings. Perhaps it's time to simply move forward. Florence frowned slightly. They shouldn't get away with it, Ellie. Not after what they put you through. I'm not sure they have gotten away with anything, I replied thoughtfully. They've lost their mother. They've been publicly exposed and legally reprimanded. Their reputations in the community are in tatters. All consequences of their own actions, Florence pointed out. Not punishment for stealing your money. True, I acknowledged. But pursuing them further would require more of my energy, more of my time, resources I'm no longer willing to spend on them. I set my mug down decisively. No, I think it's time to close that chapter. Florence looked like she wanted to argue further, but instead nodded reluctantly. It's your decision. Just don't let them mistake your grace for weakness. I think we're well past that possibility, I said dryly. The last time David tried to contact me, I had Cassandra send him a cease and desist letter. The memory still brought a twinge of sadness. After the court hearing, there had been a flurry of attempts at contact, phone calls, emails, even an awkward appearance by Melissa at my front door, with a tearful apology that seemed more focused on her own emotional needs than any genuine remorse for what she'd done. I had steadfastly refused all communication, channeling everything through Cassandra. It wasn't out of spite or anger, though those emotions had certainly been present initially. It was about boundaries, clear, firm boundaries that should have been established years ago. The tea had grown lukewarm, but I sipped it anyway, unwilling to waste even this small comfort. Frugality was a hard habit to break after decades of Careful budgeting. They're still your children, Florence said softly, reading my thoughts as she often did. It's normal to feel the loss. Yes, I agreed. But they're not the children I thought I had raised. And I'm not the mother they assumed they could manipulate and discard. Florence reached across the small table to squeeze my hand. Well, I for one am proud of the Eleanor Mercer who emerged from this ordeal. She's quite a formidable woman. I squeezed back, grateful beyond words for her friendship. She had good help. As darkness fell, we moved inside. The lake house was small but perfectly suited to my needs. 2 bedrooms, an open living and dining area with large windows overlooking the water, and a kitchen just big enough for 2. People who enjoyed cooking together. I had furnished it simply, focusing on comfort rather than style, with pieces chosen for ease of use as I continued to recover. Florence built a fire in the small stone fireplace while I prepared a light dinner. We worked in harmony, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of longtime friends. This, I realized, was what family should feel like: mutual respect, shared labor, genuine care. After dinner, as we sat by the fire with cups of decaf coffee, Florence broached a subject I knew had been on her mind. "I've been thinking about the Arizona condo," she began. "The rental agreement expires next month, and I need to make a decision about extending it." I waited, letting her find her words in her own time. "The thing is, Ellie," she continued, staring into her cup, "I'm not sure I want to go back. Not full-time, anyway." "Because of me?" I asked gently. "Florence, I'm much stronger now. You don't need to stay on as my caretaker." She looked up quickly. "It's not that, or not just that." She set her cup down, straightening her shoulders as if preparing for an important declaration. "The truth is, I like our life here. I like the quietness of the lake, the changing seasons, our evening, rituals, and I think maybe we're good for each other." The vulnerability in her expression touched me deeply. Florence, who had always been so fiercely independent, was admitting she needed connection just as much as I did. "You know, I said carefully, this house has 2 bedrooms for a reason. One was always meant for guests, but there's nothing saying it can't become something more permanent." Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you suggesting a roommate arrangement?" I clarified. "Or whatever term 2 women our age use when they decide to share a home. You could keep the Arizona place for winter getaways if you wanted. We both know my bones would appreciate some desert heat in January, but make this your home base." "You wouldn't mind?" she asked, still hesitant. "I know how much you value your independence." I laughed softly. "Florence, independence doesn't have to mean isolation. If this ordeal has taught me anything, it's that surrounding yourself with the right people is not a surrender of autonomy, it's an enhancement of it." She smiled then, relief and pleasure lighting her face. "Well, in that case, I accept your offer, Ms. Mercer." "Excellent," I said, raising my coffee cup in a toast. "To roommates, then." "To roommates," she echoed, clinking her cup against mine. "And to new beginnings." The decision felt right, a positive step forward rather than a compromise or concession. After the betrayal I'd experienced, choosing to build a household with someone I genuinely trusted was powerfully affirming. The next morning, energized by our decision, we drove into town for the weekly farmers market. It was a perfect early autumn day, the air crisp but the sun warm on our faces as we wandered among the stalls of local produce, artisanal cheeses, and handcrafted goods. "We should get extra apples for pie," Florence suggested, examining a display of heirloom varieties. "Martin mentioned he might drop by this weekend." "Martin has been dropping by quite frequently," I observed with a hint of amusement. One might almost suspect he has motives beyond checking on my recovery. Florence busied herself selecting apples, but I didn't miss the slight flush on her cheeks. Don't be ridiculous. He's concerned about your well-being, that's all. Mm-hmm, I murmured skeptically. And I suppose the new aftershave and pressed shirts are also for my benefit? Eleanor Mercer, you're seeing romance where there's merely friendship, she protested, though the color in her cheeks deepened. Besides, Martin and I are far too old for such nonsense. Nonsense? Came a familiar voice from behind us. I hope you're not referring to my legal advice, Florence. We turned to find Martin himself standing there, looking dapper in a tweed jacket and holding a bouquet of late-season dahlias. Martin! Florence exclaimed, flustered. We were just talking about you. All good things, I trust? He asked with a smile, offering the flowers to her rather than to me, I noted with satisfaction. Florence accepted them, her expression softening. They're beautiful. Thank you. I was hoping to find you both here, Martin said, addressing us equally, though his gaze lingered on Florence. I have news that couldn't wait until the weekend. Something in his tone alerted me. What is it? Has something happened with the legal proceedings? He guided us to a quiet corner away from the bustling market stalls. In a manner of speaking, yes. I received a call from Gerald Finch this morning. It seems your son has had a change of heart. My guard immediately went up. What sort of change? He wants to make restitution, Martin explained. Full restitution, including the funds that were spent. He's offering to pay back every penny, plus interest. I stared at him, skeptical. Why the sudden attack of conscience? Martin's expression was carefully neutral. Apparently, there's been a significant development in his personal life. His wife, Eleanor, has filed for divorce. The news hit me with unexpected force. Despite everything that had happened, I still cared about my son's well-being. Divorce? Why? According to Finch, she discovered what David had done. Taking your money, the property transfer, all of it. She was horrified, told him she couldn't remain married to someone who would steal from his own mother. Florence made a sound of approval. At least someone in that family has moral standards. Eleanor has always been principled, I agreed, remembering my daughter-in-law's strict sense of propriety. It had often made her seem rigid and judgmental, but in this instance, her inflexibility worked in my favor. Still, I'm surprised she didn't know about it already. Apparently, David told her the funds for the Mercedes and other purchases came from a work bonus, Martin explained. It was only when she overheard him discussing the case with Finch that she learned the truth. I processed this information slowly. David facing consequences from someone whose opinion he actually valued might be more effective than any legal punishment I could pursue. What exactly is he proposing? I asked. A structured repayment plan for the full $230,000, plus 5% interest, Martin said. Monthly payments over 3 years, secured by a lien against his home and investment accounts. Plus a formal, written apology acknowledging what he did and renouncing any future claims against your estate. It was more than I had expected, especially the last part. David relinquishing future inheritance claims was tantamount to accepting disinheritance. And Melissa? I asked. Is she part of this offer? Martin's expression clouded slightly. No, Finch represents David only. As far as I know, Melissa maintains that she was merely following her brother's lead and feels she's been punished enough by the court order. That sounded like Melissa, always the victim, never responsible. I sighed, suddenly tired, despite the beautiful day and buoyant mood of just minutes earlier. What do you think I should do, Martin? He considered his response carefully. Legally, it's a solid offer. Better than what we might achieve through continued litigation, especially regarding the already spent funds. But this isn't just a legal decision, Eleanor. It's about what you need for your own peace of mind. Florence, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. Would accepting mean reopening communication with him? Because I'm not sure you're ready for that, Ellie, regardless of how much money he's offering. It was a perceptive question, one I hadn't yet considered. Was I prepared to face David again? To read his apology, however formally worded by attorneys? To accept his payments month after month for years, each check a reminder of his betrayal? "I need time to think about this," I said finally. Martin nodded. "Of course. There's no rush to respond. The offer will stand." He hesitated, then added more gently, "For what it's worth, Finch mentioned that David seems genuinely remorseful. Whether that's due to losing his wife or finally understanding the gravity of what he did, I can't say." We walked back toward the farmer's market, the festive atmosphere now at odds with my somber mood. Florence, sensing my distraction, suggested we head home. Martin offered to drive us, and I didn't miss the way Florence's hand lingered on his arm as she accepted. Back at the lake house, I excused myself to rest while Florence and Martin remained on the porch, their conversation a gentle murmur beyond my closed bedroom door. I didn't sleep, though. Instead, I sat by the window overlooking the water, turning over Martin's news in my mind. David wanted to make amends, or at least he wanted to avoid the consequences of his actions by paying back what he had taken. Was there a difference? Did his motivation matter if the end result was the same? My financial security restored, his debt to me repaid? More importantly, what did I want? 6 months ago, I would have said justice. 3 months ago, distance. Now, watching the light play across the lake's surface, I wasn't sure. My reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," I called, expecting Florence. Instead, it was Martin who entered, his expression grave. "I'm sorry to disturb your rest, but there's something else you should know. Something I didn't want to mention at the market." I gestured for him to sit in the small chair beside the window. "What is it?" "David didn't just offer restitution," he said, settling into the chair. "He also provided information about Melissa's activities that Finch felt obligated to disclose as an officer of the court." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What kind of information?" "Financial documents suggesting Melissa and Tim have been engaged in a pattern of questionable behavior. Not just with your accounts, but with several elderly clients of Tim's consulting business." Martin's distaste was evident in his tone. "It appears they may have been systematically targeting seniors for various investment schemes." The knot tightened. "Are you saying my daughter is part of some kind of elder fraud operation?" "The evidence suggests so, yes. Tim approaches wealthy retirees, offering creative investment opportunities in exchange for substantial fees. Melissa provides the veneer of legitimacy as the responsible, trustworthy daughter of a respected nurse." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "They've been at it for several years, according to the documents David provided." I closed my eyes, absorbing this new blow. Just when I thought my children couldn't disappoint me further, this revelation proved me wrong. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment during my illness. For Melissa, at least, taking advantage of vulnerable elders was apparently a business model. "Why would David expose this?" I asked, opening my eyes again. "He must know it could lead to criminal charges against his sister." Martin's expression was somber. "According to Finch, it's part of David's come-to-Jesus moment. His wife's rejection apparently triggered some genuine soul-searching. He claims he didn't know about Melissa and Tim's broader activities until recently." "Do you believe that?" He sighed. "I don't know, Eleanor. People are capable of tremendous compartmentalization. He might well have convinced himself that your situation was different, a family matter rather than criminal exploitation." I turned back to the window, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. "What happens now? With Melissa, I mean." "That depends partly on you," Martin said carefully. "The information came to me as your attorney. I'm obligated to inform you, but not necessarily to take further action unless you direct me to." "And if I do nothing?" If we simply keep this information to ourselves, then other vulnerable seniors might continue to be victimized, he said, quietly. I know that's a heavy burden to place on you. It was indeed heavy. The thought of being responsible, even indirectly, for allowing my daughter to harm others was nauseating. But the alternative, actively participating in sending my own child to prison, seemed equally impossible to bear. I need to think, I said finally, about all of it. David's offer, Melissa's activities. It's too much to process at once. Martin stood, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Take all the time you need. I'll hold Finch off for a few days. After he left, I remained by the window until the late afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the lake. My mind circled endlessly around the impossible choices before me, finding no clear path forward. When Florence eventually came to check on me, her face etched with concern, I simply patted the seat beside me on the window bench. Martin told you? I asked as she settled beside me. She nodded. It's a lot to take in. An understatement, I said with a humorless laugh, just when I thought I was finding my footing again. Florence was quiet for a moment, then said, You know, in the ER, we sometimes had to make impossible decisions. Triage situations where every choice meant someone would suffer. This feels like that, I admitted. No matter what I decide, someone gets hurt. In those situations, she continued, we had a rule. First, do no harm. I turned to look at her. That doesn't help much when every option involves harm. Then you choose the option that prevents the most harm to the most people, she said, simply. And you forgive yourself for not being able to save everyone. Her words struck a chord. I had spent decades as a nurse making precisely such calculations, weighing competing needs, allocating limited resources, sometimes making peace with imperfect solutions. If I accept David's offer, I said slowly, it feels like I'm saying, what he did was forgivable. That our relationship can be reduced to a financial transaction. And if you report Melissa, it feels like a betrayal of maternal love, Florence added, understanding without need for explanation. I nodded, grateful for her clarity. How did we get here, Flo? How did I raise children capable of such things? You didn't, she said firmly. You raised children with every advantage of love, education, and moral example. They made their own choices as adults, choices that reflect on them, not on you. I wanted desperately to believe her, to absolve myself of responsibility for what my children had become. But maternal guilt is not so easily dismissed. What would you do? I asked finally. If you were in my position? Florence took my hand, her grip warm and steady. I think you already know the answer, Ellie. You've always known, deep down, what needs to be done. You just needed time to find the courage to do it. And looking into her eyes, I realized she was right. The path forward was clear, had been clear all along beneath the confusion of conflicting emotions. What remained was simply the strength to walk it. I squeezed her hand, drawing from her steadiness. Will you help me make some calls? There are arrangements to be made. Of course, she said without hesitation. Whatever you need. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water gold and crimson, I made my decision, not as a betrayed mother seeking vengeance, nor as a victim cowering in fear, but as the woman I had always been beneath the roles of nurse, wife, mother, and grandmother. A woman of principle who understood that sometimes the hardest path is also the only right one. Tomorrow would bring pain, without doubt, but it would also bring clarity, resolution, and perhaps eventually a measure of peace. For now, that would have to be enough. The winter morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight reflecting off the frozen lake in blinding diamonds of light. I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the bare branches of the maple tree. Their vibrant red plumage stood out starkly against the monochrome landscape of snow and ice. "Perfect day for it," Florence observed, joining me at the window. She was already dressed for our outing, sensible wool slacks, a heavy sweater, and sturdy boots. "If there can be a perfect day for such things," I replied, taking a final sip of coffee before placing the mug in the sink. 3 months had passed since Martin brought news of David's offer and Melissa's criminal activities. 3 months of careful deliberation, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. 3 months leading to today, the day of reckoning. "Are you certain you want to be there in person?" Florence asked, not for the first time. Cassandra said, "Your presence isn't legally required." I smoothed down the front of my charcoal gray dress, formal without being funereal. "I need to see it through, Flo, for my own peace of mind, if nothing else." She nodded, understanding without further explanation. That was the beauty of our friendship, the ease with which we comprehended each other's needs without excessive discussion. The drive to the county courthouse took 40 minutes, the rural road still partially snow-covered despite the plow's best efforts. Martin was waiting for us on the courthouse steps, a distinguished figure in his camel overcoat. "Right on time," he greeted us, offering an arm to each of us as we navigated the salted but still slippery steps. Judge Hargrove is known for his punctuality. The hearing's scheduled for 9 sharp. Inside, the courthouse bustled with morning activity, attorneys consulting with clients in hushed tones, court officers directing traffic, clerks rushing between offices with stacks of files. We made our way to courtroom C, where Cassandra waited outside the double doors. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, professional as always but with genuine warmth in her eyes. "Everything is in order. The prosecutor has the documentation we provided and the plea agreement has been finalized." "And Melissa?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "She's here?" Cassandra nodded. "She arrived with her attorney about 15 minutes ago. They're in a conference room down the hall." I had not seen my daughter since the initial court hearing about my property. She had made several attempts to contact me after learning of her brother's restitution offer, leaving tearful voicemails and sending handwritten letters claiming she'd been manipulated by both David and Tim. I had not responded to any of these overtures. "And Tim?" Florence asked. "Already inside," Cassandra replied. "His attorney is making a last-ditch effort to modify the terms, but the prosecutor isn't budging." The doors to the courtroom opened, and people began filing in. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what was to come. "Ready?" Martin asked softly. "As I'll ever be," I replied. We entered the courtroom, taking seats in the second row behind the prosecutor's table. I deliberately avoided looking toward the defense side, not yet prepared to face my daughter or her husband. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Hargrove entered. He was an imposing man in his 60s, with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency in his courtroom. "Be seated," he instructed, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents before him. "Case number 2023 CR 4872, State versus Timothy Lawson and Melissa Lawson. Charges include elder financial exploitation, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy." He looked up, surveying the courtroom. "I understand we have a plea agreement to consider." The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Denise Waters, rose. "Yes, Your Honor. The defendants have agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for the state's recommendation of a specific sentence structure." "Very well," Judge Hargrove nodded. "Let's proceed." What followed was a methodical recitation of the charges and evidence against Melissa and Tim. Ms. Waters detailed how they had systematically targeted at least 7 elderly individuals over a 3-year period, convincing them to invest in non-existent business ventures and using the funds for personal expenses. "And how was this scheme uncovered?" Judge Hargrove asked. "Through information provided by Mrs. Eleanor Mercer, Your Honor. Ms. Waters replied, gesturing toward me. Mrs. Mercer is defendant Melissa Lawson's mother. When Mrs. Mercer discovered she had been similarly victimized during her hospitalization for heart surgery, she made the difficult but principled decision to report her findings to authorities. I felt the weight of eyes upon me, not just from the judge and attorneys, but from spectators in the gallery. Somewhere behind me, I knew, sat my daughter, watching as her mother testified against her in open court. The decision to report Melissa and Tim had not been made lightly. After Martin revealed David's information about their elder fraud scheme, I had agonized for weeks over my moral obligation. In the end, it was a conversation with Dr. Reynolds that tipped the scales. I've seen too many elderly patients financially devastated by these kinds of scams, he had told me during a follow-up appointment. They lose their life savings, their homes, their dignity. And the worst part is, they often feel too ashamed to report it, which means the perpetrators just move on to the next victim. His words had resonated deeply. How could I justify protecting my daughter at the expense of other vulnerable seniors who might fall prey to her schemes? What kind of nurse, what kind of human being would I be if I placed my maternal feelings above the safety of others? So I had made the call to the district attorney's office, turning over the documents David had provided through his attorney. The investigation that followed uncovered even more victims than we had initially suspected. Judge Hargrove's voice pulled me back to the present. Mrs. Mercer, would you approach the bench, please? Florence squeezed my hand encouragingly as I rose, making my way forward with careful steps. Standing before the judge's bench, I felt unexpectedly calm, as if I had already moved beyond the pain of this moment to whatever lay on the other side. Mrs. Mercer, Judge Hargrove said, his tone respectful. The court recognizes the exceptional difficulty of your position in these proceedings. Would you like to make a statement before I consider the plea agreement? I had prepared for this possibility, writing and rewriting my thoughts until the words felt true to both my heartbreak and my convictions. Yes, Your Honor, I said, turning, slightly to face both the judge and the courtroom. For the first time, I allowed myself to look directly at Melissa. She sat beside her attorney, her normally stylish appearance subdued by months of stress. Her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying, hands clutched tightly in her lap. Despite everything, the sight of her distress sent a pang through my heart. She was still my child, the baby I had nursed through fevers, the little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the teenager whose broken heart I had soothed after her first rejection. But she was also a grown woman who had made unconscionable choices, who had preyed upon people like me, elderly individuals who had worked all their lives for the modest security of their retirement years. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady despite the emotions roiling beneath the surface. I stand before you not just as the mother of one of the defendants, but as someone who has spent over 40 years in nursing, caring for the most vulnerable members of our community. I've witnessed firsthand the devastation that financial exploitation can wreak on elderly individuals, not just the monetary loss, but the deep psychological harm of betrayal and shame. I paused, gathering my thoughts. When I discovered that my own daughter and her husband had systemically targeted seniors like myself, I faced an impossible choice between maternal loyalty and my duty as a citizen and healthcare provider. It was the most difficult decision of my life to come forward with what I knew. Judge Hargrove nodded encouragingly, and I continued. I do not take any pleasure in these proceedings. In fact, my heart breaks at the reality of what my daughter has become. But I believe in accountability, in making amends, and in the possibility of redemption through genuine remorse and changed behavior. I straightened my shoulders slightly. I support the plea agreement not out of vengeance, but because I believe it offers appropriate consequences while still allowing for rehabilitation. My hope is that this marks a turning point, that from this painful moment, healing and growth might eventually emerge. Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. Judge Hargrove said solemnly when I had finished. "You may return to your seat." As I turned to walk back, I found myself momentarily face to face with Melissa. Our eyes met, and in that brief exchange, I saw a complex mixture of emotions: shame, anger, fear, and beneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been understanding. I returned to my seat between Florence and Martin, drawing strength from their solid presence on either side of me. The hearing continued with statements from the defense attorneys, attempting to portray their clients in the most sympathetic light possible. Tim's lawyer emphasized his challenging childhood and struggles with addiction. Melissa's attorney painted her as an unwitting accomplice, influenced by her more culpable husband. I listened without reaction, having heard variations of these excuses during the investigation phase. The reality, as documented in painstaking detail by financial records and witness statements, showed a much more calculated partnership. Melissa had not been a passive participant, but an active recruiter of vulnerable seniors, leveraging her background as a nurse's daughter to gain their trust. Finally, it was time for the defendants to address the court before sentencing. Tim went first, offering a rehearsed apology that focused more on his own hardships than genuine remorse for those he had harmed. His performance was so transparent that I noticed Judge Hargrove's expression harden as he spoke. Then it was Melissa's turn. She rose unsteadily, her voice initially so soft that the judge had to ask her to speak up. "I'm sorry," she began, louder this time. "To the people we hurt, to the court, and—" She paused, turning slightly toward where I sat. "To my mother, whose trust I betrayed when she was at her most vulnerable." Her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself before continuing. "There's no excuse for what I did. I've spent months trying to understand how I became someone capable of such actions, and the only explanation I can offer is that I lost sight of the values I was raised with. I allowed greed and entitlement to override the integrity and compassion my mother taught me." I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral despite the emotions stirring within me. Was this genuine remorse, or just another performance for the court's benefit? After so many deceptions, it was impossible to know with certainty. "I accept full responsibility for my actions," Melissa continued, "and I accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. All I ask is for the opportunity someday to make amends, not just through financial restitution, but through demonstrating through my actions that I can be better than the person who committed these crimes." As she returned to her seat, I noticed her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Tim made no move to comfort her, sitting rigidly beside her with his gaze fixed on the middle distance. Judge Hargrove reviewed the plea agreement once more before pronouncing sentence. Tim received 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 3. Melissa, given her lesser role and clean prior record, received 3 years, with potential for release to a supervised halfway house after 18 months. Both were ordered to make full restitution to their victims and would be prohibited from holding any financial position of trust upon release. "This court takes crimes against elderly victims extremely seriously," Judge Hargrove stated as he concluded the proceedings. "The defendants exploited the vulnerability and trust of those who deserved protection and respect. Their actions represent not just criminal behavior, but a profound moral failure." With a rap of his gavel, it was over. Court officers approached to take Melissa and Tim into custody immediately, as the terms of the plea agreement had not included any delay in beginning their sentences. As they were led away, Melissa turned one last time in my direction. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, something passed between us. Not forgiveness exactly, nor reconciliation, but perhaps a mutual acknowledgement of the truth. Of who we were, who we had become, and the chasm that now existed between us. Then she was gone, disappearing through a side door with the court officers, and I was left with the hollow feeling that accompanies the conclusion of something irrevocable. Outside the courthouse, Reporters had gathered, alerted to the story of a mother testifying against her own children in an elder fraud case. Florence and Martin formed a protective buffer around me as Cassandra firmly declined requests for comment. "Mrs. Mercer has been through enough," she told the persistent journalists. "She reported this crime out of civic duty, not a desire for publicity. Please respect her privacy." In the car driving home, I was quiet, processing the morning's events. Florence and Martin exchanged concerned glances but respected my silence. It wasn't until we were crossing the bridge over the lake, the frozen expanse stretching out endlessly before us, that I finally spoke. "It feels both worse and better than I expected," I said softly. "Worse to actually see her led away in custody. Better to have it finally concluded." Florence reached across from the passenger seat to squeeze my hand. "You did the right thing, Ellie. The hard thing, but the right thing." "I know," I agreed, surprised to find I genuinely meant it. The doubt and guilt that had plagued me throughout the investigation had been replaced by a somber certainty. Not happiness. I would never be happy about my daughter's incarceration, but acceptance of the necessity of consequences. "What now?" Martin asked from the driver's seat, his eyes meeting mine briefly in the rearview mirror. It was a good question. For months, my energy and attention had been consumed by the legal proceedings, first recovering my own assets, then participating in the criminal case against Melissa and Tim. Now that it was over, what would fill the void? "Now," I said thoughtfully, "I think it's time to look forward instead of back, to build something positive from all this wreckage." When we arrived home, there was a surprise waiting on the porch. A large envelope propped against the front door. Martin retrieved it cautiously. "It's from David," he said, examining the return address. "Delivered by courier, it seems." I took the envelope inside before opening it, settling into my favorite chair by the fireplace. Florence busied, herself making tea, while Martin built a fire to ward off the winter chill. Inside the envelope was a thick document, the formal restitution agreement David had proposed, now fully executed by his attorney. Attached was a cashier's check for the first installment payment, along with a handwritten letter. "Dear Mom, by the time you receive this, Melissa's sentencing hearing will be over. I hope whatever the outcome, it brings you some measure of closure. I want you to know that my offer of restitution comes with no strings attached. I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. I understand that what I did was unforgivable, a betrayal of everything you taught me and everything you've done for me throughout my life. These payments aren't just about the money. They're about accountability, acknowledging the harm I caused and taking concrete steps to make it right. I'll continue making them whether you ever speak to me again or not. Eleanor has filed for divorce, as you may have heard. She was right to do so. No woman should be married to the kind of man who would steal from his own mother. I'm not contesting anything. She deserves better than what I've been. I've started therapy. Too late to save my marriage, probably too late to repair our relationship. But not too late to understand why I became someone capable of such selfishness and cruelty. Not too late to become someone better. I don't know what the future holds, but I wanted you to know that reporting Melissa was the right thing to do. I should have done it myself when I first discovered what she and Tim were involved in. Another failure on my part. Take care of yourself, Mom. I hope someday you can find peace and happiness, even if it's without your children in your life." With deep regret and enduring respect, David, I read the letter twice before silently passing it to Florence, who had settled on the sofa with our tea. "Well," she said after reading it, "that's surprisingly self-aware." "Indeed," I agreed, staring into the flames of the newly built fire. "I wonder if he means it." "Does it matter?" Martin asked, accepting the letter from Florence to read himself. "Whether he's sincere or not, you'll still receive the restitution." I considered this. "It matters to me," I said finally. "Not because it changes anything about our relationship, but because I want to believe he's capable of genuine growth, of becoming someone better than the man who tried to steal my home when I was fighting for my life. Martin nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, this reads like sincerity to me. There's none of the manipulation or emotional leveraging I'd expect if he were just trying to get back in your good graces. Time will tell, Florence observed pragmatically. If he keeps making the payments without pushing for more contact, that would suggest his remorse is genuine. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Yes, time will tell. In the meantime, I have other matters to consider. Florence raised an eyebrow. Such as? I sipped my tea, organizing my thoughts. I've been thinking about what you said at the courthouse, about it being a perfect day, and it struck me that we spend too much of our lives waiting for perfect days or perfect circumstances before we move forward. Martin settled into the chair opposite mine. That sounds suspiciously like the beginning of an announcement, Eleanor. I smiled, the first genuine smile since the courthouse. Perhaps it is. I've been considering what to do with my remaining years, however many or few there might be. I don't want to merely exist in the aftermath of betrayal. I want to create something meaningful from the experience. What did you have in mind? Florence asked, leaning forward with interest. I want to establish a foundation, I said, the idea becoming clearer as I articulated it. A nonprofit dedicated to educating seniors about financial exploitation and providing support to those who have been victimized. Martin's eyes lit up. That's an excellent idea. There's certainly a need for such services. I thought I might use part of David's restitution funds to get it started, I continued. It seems fitting to transform money that was taken from me into something that helps others avoid similar experiences. You'd need proper organizational structure, tax-exempt status. Martin was already thinking like an attorney, listing the practical considerations. And educational materials, perhaps a website, Florence added, equally enthusiastic. Maybe even a support group component. Their immediate engagement with the concept warmed me. This was what true family looked like. People who supported your aspirations rather than undermining them for personal gain. I'd want both of you involved, I said. If you're willing, of course. Martin, your legal expertise would be invaluable, and Florence, your healthcare background gives you unique insight into the needs of elderly patients. Try to keep us away, Florence replied with a grin. The afternoon passed in animated discussion of possibilities for the foundation. What had begun as one of the most difficult days of my life had somehow transformed into something forward-looking and hopeful. The pain wasn't gone. I doubted it ever would be completely. But it was now, accompanied by purpose. As evening fell, Martin reluctantly prepared to leave, citing an early court appearance the next morning. At the door, he hesitated, then turned to Florence. I was wondering if you might be free for dinner later this week, he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice that was endearing in a man usually so confident. Perhaps Friday? Florence's cheeks colored slightly. I think I could arrange that. After he left, she busied herself clearing the tea things, studiously avoiding my amused gaze. Not a word, Eleanor, she warned, though there was no real heat in her tone. I wouldn't dream of it, I replied innocently, though I must say, spring seems to be arriving early this year, despite all the snow. She rolled her eyes at the metaphor, but couldn't quite suppress her smile. Later that night, as Florence retired to her room and I prepared for bed, I found myself drawn to the window overlooking the frozen lake. The moon had risen, casting a silvery path across the ice. In the distance, the silhouettes of bare trees stood stark against the night sky, their branches reaching upward like supplicants. I thought about cycles, of seasons, of life, of relationships, how endings inevitably give way to new beginnings, if we allow them to. How even the harshest winter eventually yields to spring's renewal. My children had betrayed me, shattered, the family I thought we were. The pain of that would never fully disappear. But from those shards, something new was emerging. Unexpected connections, renewed purpose, a different kind of family built on mutual respect and genuine care rather than mere biological obligation. David's letter lay on my nightstand. I had not decided how or whether to respond to it. That was a decision for another day. For now, it was enough to acknowledge that his words had affected me, had opened a small window of possibility that redemption might truly be possible, even from the darkest of actions. As for Melissa, her journey would be longer and harder. The structured environment of incarceration might provide the boundaries she had never established for herself. Or it might simply harden her sense of grievance and entitlement. That, too, was beyond my control. What remained within my control was my own path forward. The foundation concept excited me in a way I hadn't felt since my early nursing days. There was so much to learn, so much to develop, so many people who might benefit from the painful wisdom I had acquired. I climbed into bed, my body tired, but my mind alive with possibilities. For the first time in many months, I fell asleep not dwelling on past betrayals, but dreaming of future achievements. Spring arrived gradually, then suddenly, as it often does in northern climates. One day, the lake was still locked in ice. The next, the shoreline had begun to thaw, revealing dark water lapping at the edges. Within a week, the ice had retreated entirely, and waterfowl returned to claim their territories. I watched these changes from my porch, noting how the landscape transformed day by day. The barren trees developed the faint green haze of emerging buds. Crocuses pushed through the melting snow around the cabin's foundation. The quality of light shifted, becoming warmer and more golden as the sun's angle changed. My own life was undergoing similar transformations. The Elder Justice Foundation was taking shape under Martin's legal guidance, with a mission statement, bylaws, and pending nonprofit status. Florence had reached out to her extensive network of healthcare contacts, gathering support and expertise. I had begun drafting educational materials based on my own experience, transforming personal trauma into practical guidance for others. David continued to make his monthly restitution payments without attempting further contact. I had not responded to his letter, still uncertain what, if anything, I wanted to say. The money went directly into a separate account, earmarked for the foundation, a conversion of exploitation into empowerment that felt both practical and symbolically significant. Melissa wrote from prison regularly. Her letters arrived every 2 weeks, growing gradually more reflective and less self-pitying as the months passed. I read them all but had not yet written back. Florence urged patience with myself. "There's no timeline for processing this kind of betrayal," she reminded me. "Take all the time you need." My health improved steadily with the changing season. Dr. Reynolds pronounced my recovery remarkable for a woman half your age during my 1-year post-surgery checkup. I had graduated from the walking stick to unaided movement, even managing short hikes along the Lakeshore Trail. Florence and Martin's relationship had blossomed alongside the spring flowers. They maintained the pretense of separate residences, he at his stately Victorian in town, she in my guest room, but spent most evenings together, either at the lake house or at intimate dinners in town. Their happiness was a constant bright spot in my days, a reminder that new beginnings could emerge at any stage of life. On a particularly beautiful May morning, I sat on the dock with my first cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of pink and gold. A pair of loons called to each other across the water, their haunting cries echoing against the distant shore. Florence joined me, settling into the adjacent chair with her own mug. We sat in companionable silence, absorbing the peaceful scene before us. "It's official," she said eventually. "Martin got the call yesterday. The Elder Justice Foundation has been granted 501(c)(3) status. We're a legitimate nonprofit organization. I smiled, savoring both the news and the perfect morning. That calls for a celebration. Already planned, she replied with satisfaction. Martin's organizing a small launch reception next week. Just a few key supporters and potential donors. Nothing too overwhelming. I nodded appreciatively. They had both become attuned to my limitations, understanding that while I was stronger, large social gatherings still drained my energy quickly. I've been thinking, I said after another comfortable silence, about David's letter and Melissa's as well. Florence waited, knowing I would continue when ready. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready to welcome them back into my life in any significant way, I continued. The breach of trust was too profound, but I'm considering responding, at least acknowledging their communications. Because? Because holding on to anger serves no purpose at this point, I said thoughtfully. It doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't protect me from future harm. I've already done that by establishing clear boundaries. All it does is keep me tethered to the past when I'm trying to move forward. Florence considered this. Acknowledging their letters doesn't mean forgiving what they did, she noted. It just means you're willing to recognize their current efforts, however small. Exactly, I agreed. Not forgiveness, necessarily. Just recognition. Acknowledgement that I see them trying, even if it doesn't change the fundamental relationship. I think that's wise, she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand, and entirely consistent with who you've always been, clear-eyed about reality, but never unnecessarily harsh. We lapsed back into silence, watching a blue heron glide across the lake before landing gracefully among the reeds. Its patient stillness as it waited for fish reminded me of something valuable, the importance of timing, of knowing when to act and when to simply observe. For months, I had needed to maintain absolute separation from my children, to heal and rebuild without their complicated presence in my life. Now perhaps I had reached a point where limited acknowledgement was possible without reopening old wounds. I'll write to them this weekend, I decided. Brief notes, nothing effusive, just letting them know I've received their communications. Florence nodded approvingly. Another step forward. One of many, I agreed, lifting my coffee mug and a small toast. To new beginnings, unexpected journeys, and the family we choose. I'll drink to that, she replied, clinking her mug against mine. As the sun rose fully above the tree line, bathing the lake in golden light, I felt a sense of profound contentment settle over me. Not happiness, exactly. The past year had been too difficult for such a simple emotion, but something deeper and more enduring. A hard-won peace built on truth, self-respect, and the courage to release what needed to be released while embracing what deserved to be embraced. My children had divided my assets while I was in hospital, it was true, but in doing so, they had inadvertently set me on a path to discovering what truly mattered. Not the material possessions or financial security they had coveted, but the authentic connections and meaningful purpose that now filled my days. That single phone call I had made, reporting their actions despite the personal pain involved, had been just the beginning. From that difficult moment had flowed a series of choices, each one leading me further from betrayal and closer to a life aligned with my deepest values. As I sat beside Florence on the sun-warmed dock, watching the day unfold across the shimmering water, I realized that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the hardest first steps, and while the path ahead remained uncertain in many ways, I was no longer walking it alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.